Hey everybody, welcome to our next big adventure in Python. Today we are going to be talking about functions. Now you've seen functions several times, I'm sure, as you're reading through the book. You may not know exactly what they were, and they may be a little confusing, but we're going to try and demystify them a little bit here and help you understand how functions can help you when you're writing code. Let's look at a couple of places where you've actually seen functions before. The first, most obvious one is print. Print is a function. So when we type hello world, and then we go to tools, terminal, and Python 3 functions.py, it printed out hello world, right? We're used to seeing that kind of thing. Print is a built-in function inside Python. You get it for free. You don't have to create that particular function. We'll figure out later how to create functions. But also, another function that's built in is length. Remember when we were looking at the length function to determine how long a list was, or how many characters, I guess, were in a string. We have to give this a variable name. So we're going to say string length is equal to len hello world, and then we want to print string length, and then we can go back over to our terminal, and it tells us we printed out hello world, but then we also printed out the length of hello world, 13 characters. Actually, I think I added an exclamation point. Yep, so hello world, including the comma and the space, 13 characters long. The length function gave us that, and we were able to print it out. Now, if you notice, there are two similarities between, let me get rid of this so it doesn't clutter us up. There are two similarities between length and print. In both cases, you have the name of the function, have an opening parentheses, then you have something in between the parentheses, and then you close them out. That something is called a parameter. We pass parameters into functions most of the time. Parameters are not required, but most usable functions take one or more parameters. You can pass as many as you need, but once you get too many, you're probably doing your function wrong. But you can pass in various parameters. We've actually seen that happen with the range, right? When we typed range. So we would usually start at 0 and go up to 10, but then in some of our exercises we saw we could actually do stepwise. So instead of going one by one, we could go by twos or by threes. So we can pass in 3 there. So in this particular case, range is a function that takes 3 parameters: your starting value, your ending value, and your step, right? So in all of these cases, you have a function name, the parentheses, and you pass in the parameters that you need to use in the function. They have to be in the specific order. In this case, you always, for the case of range, you always have to pass in your starting value, then your ending value, and then your step, right? In the case of length and print, typically only take one parameter, so order doesn't really matter there. In both length and range, you're getting a return value, whereas with print you don't. So we saw how we could assign we could assign a variable. We could assign the length back to a variable name, right? So now that length is held in this variable name, string length, right? We've seen, so that's returning a specific value, right? It's returning the number 13. range is a little bit different. We won't go into detail here, but range doesn't bring back a specific value. It brings back almost like a list. Not exactly, but almost like a list of values. But in any case, print doesn't really return anything, nothing that we really care about. So you can see that functions have to have a name, and they have to have your parentheses, but they can take an optional number of parameters, and they may or may not return an actual value to you. And we're going to dig a little more into that and actually make it clear, hopefully. Just wanted to give you an idea of where we're going with this. So let's actually look at building our own functions here. Now this is some code that I stole from inside Codio. You probably saw this if you've gone through module the unit on functions. In this case, what it's doing is, this is how we have been writing code up to this point, right? Like if we needed to figure out the volume of 3 different cylinders, the volume of 3 different cylinders, first one, second one, third one. If we wanted to see this, we would have to write out this code 3 different times, right? And if we run this now, we can see it prints out the radius and the height, and then the volume of all 3 of those. But we have a lot of repeated stuff here, right? Like we have to do that calculation. We have to write the code for that calculation 3 different times, right? We have to write the code to print that out 3 different times. It'd be really great if we didn't have to do that, if we could make that reusable and only had to do that once. Well, with functions, we can. Now, I'm going to leave this where it is for now, and I'm going to show you how to write a function that will take a lot of this code and clean it up and make it a lot simpler for us. So when we write our own functions, you have to start with the keyword def, short for define. So we are telling Python, let's define a function. So it's def, D-E-F, and then the function name. So we're going to call it cylinder volume. Right? Now, we've got the def keyword, we've got the name of the function. We also have to have our parentheses, right? The parentheses help tell Python this is a function we're defining, and the parentheses are where we're going to hold the parameters that we pass in. So we need to pass in both a radius and a height to be able to calculate the volume of a cylinder, right? They have to be separated by a comma, right? Just like they would when we call it. We'll get to that in a moment. And the last thing we need on the line that defines our function is a colon, right? The colon tells Python, I'm finished with the definition of this function. Now I'm ready to start the body of this function. And when you're writing your own functions, you'll notice everything in Python, we've seen this a few different times, but the body of something has to be indented, right? You've run into this a few different times where you create a for loop and then the body of the for loop has to be indented. An if statement, the body of the if statement has to be indented. Same is true for functions and everything else you're going to do in Python. Python is an indented language. So when we write the actual body of the function, we need to indent that. Now in this particular case, the body is actually really simple. All we need is that formula right there, right? Volume is equal to pi times radius times height, right? Pi times radius squared times height. That's the formula. So what we've done here is we are when we get ready to call this function, we're going to pass in a radius, we're going to pass in a height, and then in the body of it, it's going to do that calculation for us, right? So when we go to call a function, the way you call it is just like we would have called it, just like we called functions for print and for length. We make sure you are not indented. You're at a different indentation level, but all you need to do is say cylinder volume, and you pass it in a radius and a height. So let's go ahead and pull those two out, put them right there, and I'm going to very quickly, let's just go ahead and get rid of, I need the import statement. So let's get rid of all of that, right? We're going to replace all of that code more or less. So what we're doing here is we've defined a function called cylinder volume. We've just defined a variable called radius, that's 125, another variable height, that's 2520, and we are calling the cylinder volume function. We're going to pass in that radius and that height, right? So let's do this. Let's print volume right there, right? So now we are printing out the volume that we have calculated. And if we run this, it prints out that incredibly huge number as the volume of that cylinder. Now this is okay if what you want to do is just print the volume, but more than likely what you're going to end up doing in some other calculation is not printing out the volume but using that volume, right? So let's say you have to figure out, I don't know, some rate of flow of liquid into a cylinder, right? So you need to calculate the volume, but you don't need to print it out. You need to have that volume in its own variable that you can use. You can't, because of the way Python holds onto variables, the volume right here, well, let's just do it right here. Actually, let me show you. If we try to print, we're going to call this volume 2 of our Python greatest hits. Now, and we're getting an error, a name error. Volume is not defined, and it's on line 10 that we're getting that error. So if we go back over here and look, line 10 is where we try to print volume the second time, right? But it's telling us, Python's telling us the volume's not defined. It doesn't know what volume is. That's because we defined volume inside of a function, and that variable lives only inside the function. It cannot come outside the function. So when we try to call it down here, Python's like, I don't know what you're talking about, man. Like, yeah, I used a volume up there in that cylinder volume function, but man, that was forever ago. I don't know what this is. You haven't told me what volume is right now. So what we have to do with functions is we have to give them a return value. So if we want to print volume 2 down here, we have to return that volume to the caller. Right? So we're going to say return volume right there. So this is telling Python, okay, do my calculation. Once you've calculated that volume, return it back to whoever calls. Well, right here on line 10 is where we're calling. Right? This is where we're saying, okay, I have my radius on line 8, I have my height on line 9. Take those and push them up to the cylinder volume function and give me back the whatever the volume is, right? In order to do that, we just have to set a new variable the same way that we did when we were returning the length of something, right? So we can here also say volume equals cylinder volume, right? Now, actually, we're going to do this. We're going to call that volume 2, so we don't get too confused, because it's a good idea not to use the same variable name inside a function and outside a function that are very close together, so you don't confuse yourself. When in doubt, try to come up with a new name for a variable. It will always, it's always to your benefit. So in this case, we're saying, okay, call into cylinder volume, send it the radius and the height, whatever it calculates, whatever it sends me back, put that in the variable called volume 2, then I'm going to print out that variable. And now if we run this, we get volume 2 and that crazy big number again, right? So what we've done here is we have defined a function, we've given it the parameters that it's going to need in order to do its job. We've done some sort of calculation, we've returned that calculation, and then down here, this is where we're actually using it. This is where we're setting a radius and a height, and then we're calculating the volume, and then we're going to print it out, right? Now we created the function so that it would be easier for us to calculate the volume of cylinders over and over again and not have to rewrite so much code. So if we wanted to now calculate the volume of more cylinders, all we have to do is call that cylinder volume function again. We can actually do something called function composition, where we can take one function and use it as a parameter to another function. So in this case, we're going to take the function print, and we're going to say vol1, and we are, so vol1 is one of the parameters that we send to print. The other parameter that we're going to send is actually a call to cylinder volume, and we can pass it whatever parameters we want. We don't necessarily have to put them in variables. We can actually just sort of hard code them in here. So we can say we're going to send it a radius of 10 and a height of 45, right? And then if we want to print vol2, and we can say this time we want it to print, a radius of 3 and a height of 21. Let's get rid of this so that doesn't clutter anything up. And if we run this now, we will see it prints volume 1 and volume 2, the two different volumes based on the parameters that we've sent it. And what we've done is instead of assigning everything to variables that we don't necessarily need, in this case, we have just passed our call to cylinder volume. We have passed it as a parameter to our call to print, right? So whenever you to call a function, again, it's just to use the function's name, parentheses, and then pass in whatever parameters, right? That's a call to the cylinder volume. Now, in this particular case, if we don't assign it to a variable, Python does all the work, but when it returns the volume right here, it just throws it away. It doesn't have anything to assign it to, so you're doing all this work and then for no good reason, right? Like it's not being assigned to a variable, so it just gets thrown away. Sometimes that's what you want to do, but usually not. Usually you want to either use it inside another function or assign it to a variable, so that you can then use that variable somewhere else down the line. Another way you can remove variable names if you want to is we don't actually need to put that in a variable name. We can just say return that. We need to get rid of this one. Come on. There So now this is telling Python, okay, do this calculation, and then once you've done the calculation, just give it back, just return it, right? That way, you don't have to create an extra variable. It's oftentimes a good idea to create the variable name, especially if your functions are much more complicated, and they can be a lot more complicated. They can have a lot of code in them. I've seen functions that are hundreds of lines long. That's not the best way to write functions. You're better off writing much smaller functions that do one thing at a time, but sometimes you can't get around it. And when you write large functions, then you need to probably do a lot of your calculations or whatever you're doing and assign things back to variables, so you'll have a record of what you're doing as you go, 20 or 30 lines into a function. Let's see, I think that's probably about all. I just want to make sure that we're clear on a couple of things, so let's just rehash some of this. When we create a function, start with the keyword def, give the function name, open parentheses, any parameters that you need to pass in, close parentheses, and then a colon. Don't forget the colon. And then the body of the function, which can be one line or hundreds or thousands of lines if you absolutely needed it. The body of the function is all indented at the same level. And then when you go to call a function, you make sure that you are not indented at that level, because anything indented at this level right here, Python is going to read as part of that function, right? So we can actually add a little bit more code here. Let's just say if radius is greater than 10, right? So now every time we call cylinder volume, it will go through this whole bit of code and tell us, it will evaluate how big radius is and do a print statement and then do this return statement. Now you can see here that we have a couple of different levels of indentation. Every part of the body is at least indented that far, right? And then under the if statement, you've got another level of indentation, also under the else statement. But then once you're finished with the else, you have to come back out on your indentation. And let me show you how important that is. Right now, if we run it as is, it will tell us, I know what I did wrong. Hold on a second. Greater than or equal to 10. Let's do that. Let's clear this, run it again, and then the first one comes in as that's big, and it gives us our volume. The second one's not so big, gives us that volume. If we're not careful with our indentation, if we accidentally indent the return at the same level as the else, the return is only going to get hit if this else branch gets taken, right? So right now, the return won't, the function will not return a value if the radius is greater than or equal to 10. So if we run that right now, we get volume 1 is none. That's the default return value for any function. If you don't give it a return value that Python can read, if you don't give it a return value at all, like some functions you don't need a return value depending on what they're doing, but if you don't give it a return value, it will automatically return none. In most cases, that's probably not what you want to do. In this case, it's definitely not. We want to actually see the radius when it's 10. So what we have to do is make sure that the return statement is not indented, so that when we run it, it actually gives us a value back, not just none. Anyway, I hope that clears up some confusions you might have about functions. If you have any questions, leave them for me in discussion, or leave it a comment, or send me an email. And good luck with our next bit of code, and I will see you all later.